Okay, now it's time to get to know your camera inside and out. So before we start shooting anything, let's go through all the settings that we can control here on our camera phone. So over here you can choose your resolution or video size. Here we got it set to the lowest, which is HD. HD is only 720 pixels. Usually the standard is full HD, which is 10,080 pixels. This is the standard used by TV and also on YouTube. And here you also see this number 30 or 60, and that's the frame rate. The higher the frame rate is, means the more smoother it looks. And also at the same time, you can slow or stretch out that footage to make slow motion shots. So here, full HD, 60 frames per second or 30 frames per second. Then you have Ultra HD, which is 4K, and this is super high resolution, and the footage is more detailed, more closer, but at the same time it's a bigger file size. But what's great with shooting Ultra HD or 4K is you can crop in or zoom into that image, especially if your final output is going to be lesser than 4K. For example, you're just using full HD. Then over here you can choose the size of your frame. You can make it square 1 by 1, which is getting more popular now, especially because of Instagram. But even movies, short films, commercials are being shot this way because of the social media feed. Or 16 by 9 is the typical widescreen ratio or size used by televisions and computer monitors. Now I'm going to show you how to use your camera on automatic settings. So recording video is easy as pressing this red button. And now that's recording. Now you have an option to control what to focus by touching the screen. And if you hold it there, you can tell it to lock. So it won't change focus when you move your camera. Once it's locked in there too, you can also control the exposure. Make it brighter, and it'll stay that way. Otherwise, if it's not locked, it'll be like this. Focus will always change. Now some phones also come with a Pro mode, which gives you more controls over your camera. So if we go over here to more and then Pro Video, here you can see more controls. And notice how everything is now is manual. If before in auto, we would just have to control what to focus on, and now every little aspect is controlled. For example, here you can control what kind of microphone you're using, and you can manually control the volume or recording level. Here you can control the ISO. And ISO changes the brightness, the artificial brightness of the image. Do keep note, the more ISO you use, the more grainier or noisier the footage is. So it'll be less sharp, or the quality will be less. So it's nice to keep it at a low ISO. Over here we can control the shutter. And think about real cameras, and they have a shutter or like a gate that goes between the camera lens and where the film or the image goes. The faster the shutter is, that means the faster it opens and closes, the less light comes in. The slower the shutter is, so 1/30th of a second, the more light can come in. But the effect of a faster shutter is the footage becomes more choppier, and a slower shutter makes the footage more echoey. But there's a general rule called the 180 shutter rule, where you keep it at 1/50th of a second, which is how the natural eye looks when we see things. So that's the shutter, and you see this F number too, that's also the aperture. So now more newer phones allows you to change the aperture. The aperture, measured in f-stops, is how wide or open the lens is. The wider it is, meaning the smaller the number, the more light can come in. The bigger the number, the less light can come in. So we'll click here. So f2.4, there's the shutter now, and you see it's darker. We do a wider aperture, f1.5 allows more light in. And also the effect of aperture is, the lower the aperture or the smaller the number is, the more also you get this depth of field effect, where the background is blurred compared to the subject. See, when you increase the aperture, the background is not as blurred So keep in mind if you want to do shots, especially cinematic shots where you just want to focus on the subject. And so it's these three things, the ISO, the aperture, and the shutter, that controls the exposure, or how much light comes into the camera. And this is called the exposure trinity or the exposure triangle. So when you change one, it will affect the others, or you will have to adjust the others. So for example, if you want to keep the ISO low, then to make the image properly exposed, you'll want to increase the shutter speed or increase the aperture. But say you want to keep the shutter at a certain rate, then you'll have to change the other two, the ISO brighter or the aperture wider, but that's the max. And again, if you want to keep the aperture f1.5, then you'll have to adjust the other two, such as the shutter speed or the ISO. So it's these three things that you have to balance to keep the proper exposure. And you'll see over here, if your image is properly exposed, it will show you a number that will either be minus or plus, showing you that it's overexposed or underexposed. So of course the goal is to get it to 0. Okay, now we are properly exposed. Here in the manual controls too, we can control the focus. So you can either keep it on auto or use manual focus. This is where you yourself get to control how to focus or what to focus. And this is handy if you want to do, like, for example, a move or technique called a focus pull, where you want to focus something in the back, then you want to change the focus to something in the front. Then we have here the control WB for white balance, and it gives you a number. Right now it's 5600K or 5600K. K stands for kelvins. It's a measurement of the temperature of light. If we change the temperature here lower, you'll notice, see how things change the color? So now it's cooler. If you go the other way, now it's warmer. So if you click it, you can do an auto, and that'll keep it to the best color settings. So white is white. That's what white balance does. Then lastly, here in the Pro Controls, you get to control different aspects of the image. So for example, the saturation, highlights, the brightness of the whites. You can make them less bright. Shadows, you can make them less dark or more dark. This one is contrast, less contrast. Then you have tint that changes the color, and then the temperature, so warmer or colder. So you can control all that here. So that covers the Pro video mode for those phones that have this option. And it gives you full manual control, much like a professional DSLR camera.